The crowd pressed in, silent, tense, waiting. Smoke curled through the morning air. Somewhere, a woman sobbed. A child clutched his father's coat. No one spoke, but everyone watched. Joan of Arc, 19 years old, was led into the square, shackled, shorn, eyes locked on something far beyond the crowd. She didn't plead, she didn't cry. At the center stood a tall wooden stake. Beneath it, stacked timber, dark, damp, waiting. A priest murmured prayers. Soldiers shifted their weight. The air was heavy, but she stood straight. Then came the spark, then the smoke, then the sound of wood catching flame. And through it all, her voice, calm, defiant, rising. Jesus, Jesus. No one there would forget what they saw next. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy, nestled in war-torn northeastern France. Her family were poor farmers, devout Catholics scraping by in a world shattered by the 100 Years' War. English raids were common. Fields were burned, neighbors fled, and death was never far from the edge of the forest. She was an ordinary girl in an extraordinary time, until the voices came. At 13, Joan claimed to hear celestial commands. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They told her she had been chosen by God to drive out the English and restore France. These weren't comforting whispers. They were divine marching orders. She resisted at first. Who would believe a peasant girl could change the fate of a kingdom? But the voices were relentless. At 16, she cut her hair, dressed in men's clothes, and sought out Charles VII, the disputed heir to the French throne. After intense religious scrutiny and a mysterious secret Joan revealed only to Charles, he gave her a small force to relieve the siege of Orléans. She didn't just relieve it. She led a miraculous victory. Overnight, she became the Maid of Orléans, a symbol of holy defiance and national hope. But power makes enemies. A peasant girl in armor, commanding nobles, speaking with saints. To some, she was sent by God. To others, she was a dangerous anomaly that had to be destroyed. The path to the stake had already begun. In May 1430, Joan's divine mission came to a brutal halt. While defending the besieged town of Compiègne, she led a sortie against Burgundian forces, loyal to England. As the French retreated, Joan stayed behind to cover them. She was pulled from her horse, captured, and dragged away in chains. Her fate was sealed not on the battlefield, but in negotiations. She was sold to the English for 10,000 livres, a ransom paid not for freedom, but for punishment. Transferred to Rouen, she was locked away in a dank stone cell, guarded by male soldiers. She had no contact with the outside world. She was denied a church trial in neutral territory. Even her request for female guards, on grounds of modesty, was denied. She attempted escape. Once, she jumped from a tower, landing hard, but surviving. But the real torture came from isolation and interrogation. The church would judge her, they said. But behind the robes and scripture were swords, politics, and a burning desire to see her silenced. Joan's trial began on January 9, 1431, in Rouen. But this was no search for truth. It was a calculated demolition. The court was led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a staunch English ally. The charges: heresy, witchcraft, wearing male clothing, and claiming to hear divine voices. But the real offense: daring to act with divine authority in a world ruled by men and monarchs. Joan stood alone. No legal counsel, no real defense. She was questioned relentlessly, tricked with complex theological traps. Her enemies wanted her to contradict herself or slip into blasphemy, yet she held firm. One priest asked if she was in God's grace. Her reply chilled the room. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may He keep me there." But truth didn't matter. On May 24th, under threat of execution, she signed an abjuration, admitting guilt and promising to change. For a moment, her life was spared. Then came the final snare. She was found again, wearing male clothing in her cell. She said her voices had returned, that her abjuration was forced. The church called it relapse. The sentence was death. But they didn't want a simple execution. They wanted a public unmaking, not just to kill her body, but to destroy her message, her power, her voice. She wasn't to be forgotten. She was to be burned out of memory. The morning of May 30th, 1431, broke under a heavy grey sky. Rouen streets were lined with English soldiers and curious townspeople. A girl, barely a woman, was led from her cell, chained, pale, and barefoot. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from resolve. Joan of Arc had spent her last night in prayer. She confessed her sins. She asked for the Eucharist. One sympathetic guard crafted a crude wooden cross and tied it to her dress. She clutched it like a lifeline. The execution site was Place du Vieux Marché, the old market square. Waiting for her was a towering stake, surrounded by a platform layered in kindling and soaked in pitch. A sign hung around her neck: "Relapsed heretic." A crowd of thousands pressed in. Some cheered, others wept. They tied her tightly to the post. A Dominican friar stood beside her, holding a crucifix high. Joan asked him to keep it close to her eyes so she could see it through the fire. "Jesus," she whispered, again and again. The flames were lit. At first, only smoke, then heat, then fire, climbing fast, devouring her clothes, her skin, her hair. Her voice rose above the crackling. "Jesus! Jesus!" Witnesses said she died with his name on her lips. It wasn't quick. The executioners burned her twice more, ensuring nothing remained. Her ashes were gathered and dumped into the River Seine, as if to erase her from the earth completely. No relics, no bones, no shrine. But even among the English, some recoiled. One soldier reportedly cried out, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." They had meant to extinguish her forever. Instead, they set fire to a legend. The flames may have consumed Joan's body, but her execution sparked something far more powerful: doubt, outrage, and eventually, redemption. In the years that followed, France turned the tide against English occupation. Charles VII, the very king Joan had helped crown, remained silent at her death, but he couldn't escape her shadow. In 1455, 24 years after she was burned, he ordered a retrial, not out of grief, but to clear his own legacy from the stain of heresy. Over 115 witnesses came forward: villagers, soldiers, priests. They testified not to witchcraft, but to her courage, faith, and integrity. On July the 7th, 1456, the church declared her original trial invalid. She was called a martyr. Her conviction was overturned, her name restored. Centuries passed. Her story only grew. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Today, she is France's national heroine, a symbol of faith, defiance, and the fire of conviction. Statues now stand where her stake once burned. Her memory is kept not in ashes, but in stone, in prayer, and in history. They tried to silence her. Instead, they made her eternal. Joan of Arc's story is a mirror, and what it reflects isn't just sainthood, but power, fear, and the ruthless machinery of control. She was a teenage girl with no title, no wealth, no education. And yet, kings listened, armies followed. Her faith made her dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was unshakable. The church condemned her, not because she was wrong, but because she refused to bow. She wore men's clothing, led soldiers, and claimed to speak for God. That terrified the powerful. Her trial was a lesson. Believe what you want, but do not challenge authority. They called her a heretic, but it was never really about theology. It was about politics, about silencing someone who made the wrong people uncomfortable. And yet, even tied to a stake, she never gave them what they wanted: fear, apology, or retreat. Joan didn't just die for her faith. She was murdered by a world that couldn't handle what she represented. That defiance, that's her true legacy. Joan of Arc died screaming in fire, but her voice never went silent. They tried to erase her with ash. Instead, they lit a torch that still burns 6 centuries later. A peasant girl defied kings, faced death, and never broke. Her courage didn't end at the stake. It began there. Her story still haunts, still questions, still demands answers. Do you think Joan of Arc was a saint, a soldier, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten histories.